When my daughter mailed a birthday card to her best friend, she signed it with "Love, Dad." The problem? That wasn't me. For most of her life, I'd been a ghost. The father who left when she was still in kindergarten. I thought time would heal, that maybe years later I could slip back in, offer an apology, and we'd pick up the pieces. But this card, it wasn't just paper, it was a verdict. Someone else had filled the role I abandoned. I stared at that signature, her handwriting, but another man's name. Every letter felt like a verdict on my failures. That card dragged me back 25 years to the day I walked away. I told myself it was for her good. I told myself I'd come back when life was stable. I didn't expect stability to look like another man in my place. What I didn't know then was that the card was just the first crack. Behind it, there were years of secrets, half-truths, and a story my daughter believed that painted me as the villain. This isn't a story about winning her back overnight. It's about what happens when the truth, buried for decades, finally comes to light, and how a father who vanished has to fight for the right to even be heard. Before we begin, stay with me. You'll want to hear how this story ends. My name is Nam Bennett, and at 55, I've gotten used to the silence of an empty house. The hum of the refrigerator, the groan of the floorboards when the wind shifts, it's all I hear most days. I rent a modest place on the edge of Amarillo, Texas. A coffee pot, a small TV, and a worn leather couch are the only companions I've kept. For most of my life, I worked the kind of job that keeps you in motion but far from home. Long-haul trucking. I used to believe that miles on the road were just part of being a provider, that a good paycheck could replace a father's presence. I learned too late that money doesn't hug a child goodnight. I was 29 when I became a father. My daughter, Claire, came into the world on a stormy night in Dallas. I remember holding her in my arms, promising myself I'd give her a better life than I had. Back then, I thought a promise was enough to make it true. The truth is, promises can drown in unpaid bills and long arguments. Her mother, Emily, and I had our share of both. She wanted stability. I kept chasing paychecks across the country. It wasn't just the money. It was my pride, my stubborn belief that if I worked harder, things would get better. But the harder I worked, the further I was from home and from her. By the time Claire was 5, the cracks in our marriage had turned into a canyon. Emily filed for divorce. I didn't fight her. Not because I didn't care, but because I thought walking away might give Claire the peace we couldn't find under the same roof. That was the story I told myself, at least. The real reasons are harder to explain. Some truths don't fit neatly into a custody agreement. There were debts I didn't want tied to her future, and choices I made that still keep me awake some nights. I told Emily I'd stay away until I could stand on my own feet. She didn't argue. In fact, she seemed almost relieved. I left Dallas in an old Kenworth truck, thinking I'd circle back in a year or two. 1 year turned into 5, 5 into 10. The postcards I sent came back unopened. Birthday presents were returned. I kept driving, telling myself she was better off without the K I carried with me. Now, decades later, I'm parked in a different kind of stillness. My career ended with a back injury 2 years ago. Retirement wasn't something I planned. It was something that happened to me. I spend my mornings at a diner off Route 287, drinking black coffee, reading newspapers that still feel a week behind. Sometimes I watch families at other tables. Fathers cutting pancakes for little girls, laughing over spilled syrup. It's a sight I can't look at for too long. Claire is 28 now. I haven't been part of her birthdays, her graduations, or the small, ordinary moments that build a life. Most of what I know about her comes in glimpses. A Facebook post I wasn't meant to see. A photo someone sent me by accident. And then, most recently, that birthday card. That card was more than ink and paper. It was proof of what I already feared. Another man had stepped in where I'd stepped out. A man who lived in the same house, attended the school events, sat in the front row of her life. He earned the title Dad, not by birthright, but by presence. I can't blame her for loving him. I can't even blame her for pushing me away. But the card, it stirred something I thought I'd buried long ago. Regret, yes, but also a stubborn ember of hope. Because here's the thing about the road. No matter how far you've driven in the wrong direction, there's always a turn you can take. I don't know if mine will lead back to her. I don't know if she'll slam the door in my face. But I do know this. I can't stay parked here forever. And somewhere in the quiet of my empty house, I've decided it's time to start the engine again. I used to tell myself that a phone call every few months was enough. That a card, a letter, or a present once in a while could stand in for the father I wasn't. At first, Claire would answer the phone with a shy, "Hi, Dad." It was always short, her voice small, but it was enough to keep me going. I clung to those calls like lifelines, even when they grew further apart. In the early years after the divorce, I sent her little things I could afford from the road. A stuffed bear from a truck stop in Missouri. A snow globe from Denver. A tiny charm bracelet I found in a store in Phoenix. I don't know if she kept any of them. She never mentioned them in our brief calls, and I never asked. The first sign things were changing came when she was 10. I'd saved up to buy her something special that year, a guitar. I remembered her saying she wanted to learn music, and I thought maybe this would be a way to connect. I shipped it carefully, wrapped in bright paper with a note. Play it loud enough so I can hear it from here. 2 weeks later, the guitar arrived back on my porch. The box untouched, except for a note in a handwriting that wasn't hers. Please don't send gifts anymore. It's confusing for her. I stared at that box for hours, the return label like a slap. That was the day I realized that the distance wasn't just miles anymore. It was growing in her heart. It wasn't anger that hit me first. It was a deep, hollow kind of sadness. I put the guitar in the corner of my living room, where it sat gathering dust for years. After that, the calls nearly stopped. When I tried to call, I got polite excuses or went straight to voicemail. Once or twice I heard another voice in the background, steady and warm. At first, I assumed it was Emily's new partner. I didn't know his name then, but I could hear the ease in Claire's tone when she spoke to him, a kind of comfort I'd never been able to give her. By the time she turned 13, I started to hear his name, Mark. It came up in small ways. A comment about Mark taking me to the science fair, or Mark coaching my soccer team. It was always casual, but I felt each mention like a nail quietly sealing a door. I didn't hate him. How could I? He was there when I wasn't. He was steady, present. All the things I told myself I'd be one day, he was already doing. But every milestone that should have been mine, her first piano recital, her middle school graduation, her driver's license, had a shadow across it instead. There's one memory that still stings. She was 16, and I drove down to Dallas for her high school awards night. I didn't tell anyone I was coming. I thought I'd surprise her. I sat in the back of the auditorium, watching her walk across the stage in a pale blue dress. When she gave her thank you speech, she smiled at the audience and said, "I wouldn't be here without my mom and my dad, Mark." She didn't see me slip out before the applause ended. I drove all night, not because I had somewhere to be, but because the road was the only place I didn't have to sit still with what I felt. Over the years, the distance between us became less about geography and more about history. Every year I stayed away, the bridge between us rotted a little more. And Mark? He wasn't just a stepfather in name. He became her father in every way that counted. The birthday card I saw this year wasn't the first time she'd signed his name, but it was the first time I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. Because no matter how far I had driven, no matter how much time had passed, a part of me always believed there was still a lane open back to her. Now, I wasn't so sure that lane existed anymore. Over the years, invitations to family events started showing up in my mailbox. At first, I thought it was a sign of thawing ice, a chance to step back into my daughter's life, even if only as a distant guest. Weddings of cousins I hadn't seen in decades, barbecues at Emily's sister's house, Claire's college graduation. I went to most of them, but every time I arrived, I felt the invisible line between family and visitor. My seat was always in the back, away from the main table. Conversations slowed when I approached. Photos were taken without me, or I'd be called in for a token shot, standing at the edge of the frame. I told myself I didn't mind. I told myself showing up mattered more than where I sat. But each time I drove home, that gnawing feeling stayed with me. I wasn't part of her life. I was a tolerated presence. Then came the card. It was a photo a mutual acquaintance had posted online, a simple picture of a birthday card Claire had written for her best friend. The inside read, "Love, Dad," and the signature was Mark's name. At first, I laughed bitterly. Of course it was Mark. He'd been there for her birthdays, her tears, her milestones. He'd stood in every place I wasn't. But as I stared at the picture, the laughter died. That wasn't just a card. It was a verdict. And it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I told myself not to be dramatic. It was just ink, just a signature. But deep down, I knew it was something more. It was a symbol of where I stood in her life, outside. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer, thinking about all the years I'd missed. My phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Dave, who still lived in Dallas. We hadn't talked in years, but he'd heard I was back in touch, at least on the edges of the family circle. We talked about old times, and then he said something I didn't expect. "You know, I've run into Mark a few times. He's mentioned you." My first instinct was to tense. "Yeah? What did he say? Nothing bad. Actually, he said you're a good man, that you did what you thought was best. He never talks down about you. I sat there, the beer sweating in my hand, trying to make sense of that. All these years, I'd painted Mark as the man who took my place, the rival, the better version of me. And now I was being told he'd spoken well of me. It didn't fit the story I'd been telling myself. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not anger, not resentment, curiosity. If Mark wasn't the one poisoning my relationship with Claire, then who was? That thought stayed with me as I watched the sun set over the empty street. The card still felt like a knife in my chest, but now there was another layer to it. Maybe the story wasn't as simply as I thought. Maybe there were things I didn't know. And maybe, just maybe, I'd been holding on to the wrong villain all along. I hadn't planned on going to Dallas. At least, that's what I told myself. But a week after seeing the birthday card, I found myself packing a duffel bag, gassing up my old Chevy, and heading east. The miles blurred past like they used to, but this time there was no delivery, no company schedule, just a quiet pull I couldn't shake. Dallas had changed. The skyline was taller, the traffic worse. But some things were the same. The smell of barbecue drifting from old streets, the sprawl of neighborhoods I used to know. I drove past Emily's old house without stopping. The shutters were painted a different color now, a new car in the driveway. I didn't expect to see Claire there, but it was still strange to think of my memories existing in someone else's life now. I'd done my homework before coming. A social media scroll here, a friend's casual comment there. Claire lived in a quiet suburb north of the city. I didn't plan on knocking on her door. I wasn't ready for that kind of rejection, but I thought maybe, just maybe I could see her, just to know she was okay. The first time I saw her in person in years was by accident. I'd parked across from a small cafe I knew she liked. One of those places with warm lighting and chalkboard menus. I didn't go inside. I stayed in my truck, hands on the wheel, watching through the glass. She walked in wearing a pale yellow dress, her hair longer now. She laughed with the barista, the kind of laugh that came from someone comfortable in their life. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't look like someone carrying the weight of an absent father. Then he walked in. Mark. He wasn't hard to spot. Still tall, still carrying himself like someone who belonged. He smiled when he saw her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. They ordered drinks, found a table by the window, and fell into easy conversation. I should have felt anger. I should have felt jealousy. But what I felt instead was complicated. There was bitterness, yes, a sting that he'd been there all along, in all the moments I'd missed. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite admit to myself without feeling weak. Relief. She looked happy. I sat there for almost an hour, watching them talk. At one point, she leaned across the table, laughing at something he said. He grinned back, and I realized this wasn't just the smile of a stepfather playing a role. This was the smile of a man who loved her like his own. I told myself that should be enough for me, that her happiness was what mattered. But the truth is, it wasn't enough, because I wanted to be part of that happiness. Over the next few days, I found myself driving by places I knew she might be: the grocery store near her house, the park she used to love as a child. I never approached. I kept my distance, just far enough to feel like a shadow. Each time I saw her, that knot in my chest tightened. She looked content. She looked whole. And each time I was reminded of my absence, of the years I'd been nothing more than a name she didn't use. One afternoon, I parked across from her house. It was modest, well kept. A flower bed out front. 2 cars in the driveway, hers and Mark's. Through the front window, I saw movement. A small group of people, laughter spilling out even from where I sat. For a moment, I imagined myself inside, sitting at the table, passing the salt, listening to her talk about her day. Then the porch light flicked on, and I realized how foolish I was being. I wasn't part of that life. I was a bystander. That night, back in my motel room, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her smile, kept hearing that laugh. It was a good sound, but it was a sound I hadn't earned. And for the first time in years, the question I'd been avoiding finally pushed its way forward. Was I here for her, or was I here for me? It took me 3 days to work up the courage to send the message. I must have typed it out a dozen times, erasing and rewriting, trying to make it sound casual, like it wasn't the most important text I'd sent in years. Hey, Claire, I'm in town for a few days. Wondered if you'd like to grab dinner. Just the 2 of us. No pressure. I stared at the screen for a long minute before pressing send. Then I set the phone down on the nightstand, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Every vibration made my chest tighten. 2 hours later, her reply came. Hi, Dad. I appreciate the invite, but this week is pretty busy. Maybe another time. It was polite, too polite, the kind of response you give to a distant acquaintance, not a father. I typed a quick reply. Of course, I understand, and left it at that. The next day, I tried again. This time, I suggested coffee instead, something small, less pressure. Her reply was almost immediate. I don't want to make things awkward with Dad. I hope you understand. At first, I didn't even process what she'd written. Then it hit me. She didn't mean me. She meant Mark. That one sentence landed heavier than any rejection I'd had before. It wasn't just that she was saying no. It was that she was saying yes to someone else. His comfort, his feelings, his place in her life. I put the phone down and just sat there, staring at the wall. I told myself I wouldn't reach out again. I told myself it was better to let her live her life without me disrupting it. But the truth is, I couldn't stop thinking about that one word, awkward. When had my presence become something to avoid? 2 days later, my phone buzzed. I expected another polite dismissal, maybe a reminder to give her space. Instead, it was a number I didn't recognize. Hi, Nam. This is Mark. I froze. I hadn't spoken to him directly in more than a decade. The message continued. I think we should meet. Just us, if you're willing. I stared at the screen, wondering if it was some kind of trap, but his tone was straightforward. There was no accusation, no hostility, just an invitation. I hesitated before replying. Sure. When and where? He sent the name of a diner just off the highway, a quiet place far from their neighborhood. We agreed to meet the next morning. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Why? Why would he want to meet me? When I walked into the diner, he was already there, seated at a corner booth with the 2 coffees on the table. He looked older, of course, his hair grayer, lines deeper around his eyes. But he still had that steady presence, the kind that made people feel comfortable. "Nam," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Thanks for coming." I slid into the booth across from him. "Wasn't sure you'd want to see me." He gave a small smile. "I figured it's better to talk than to keep dancing around each other." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward. "I know Claire turned down dinner. She didn't tell me about it, but I can guess why. She's protective of me. She doesn't want to create tension." "Tension," I repeated, the word tasting bitter. "It's not about replacing you," he said quickly. "I've never tried to do that. But I was there when she needed someone, and I think she feels caught in the middle now." I stared at him. "So what are you saying? That I should back off?" He shook his head. "I'm saying maybe she needs space, but I also think she needs the truth. She's heard one version of why you left. I think you should tell her yours. When she's ready to hear it." I sat back, absorbing his words. There was no malice in his voice, no sense of victory, just an odd sincerity that I hadn't expected. For years, I'd told myself Mark was the wall between me and my daughter. Now, sitting across from him, I wasn't so sure. Mark didn't touch his coffee for a while. He just sat there, watching me the way someone studies a road map before deciding which way to turn. "There's something you should know," he finally said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it. "Claire knows why you left. At least, she knows what she's been told." My chest tightened. "And what exactly has she been told?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Emily told her you left because you couldn't handle the responsibility, that you chose the road over your family, that you thought she and Claire were better off without you." I leaned back in the booth, staring at the dull pattern on the tabletop. It wasn't exactly a lie. I had chosen the road, in a way. I had thought they were better off. But there was more to it than that. Things Emily never wanted aired out. "She believed it," Mark continued. "Why wouldn't she? You weren't there to give her another version. You missed birthdays, graduations, school plays. I don't say that to hurt you, Nam. I say it because I think she deserves the full story before she makes decisions that last a lifetime." I looked up sharply. "What decisions?" Mark hesitated just long enough for me to know this wasn't something casual. Then he said, "She's getting married." The words landed like a sudden curve in the road you didn't see coming. "She's what?" "She hasn't announced it publicly yet, but it's coming, and—" He stopped, choosing his next words carefully. "She's conflicted. Not about him, about you." I let out a dry laugh that didn't sound anything like humor. "About me? She barely answers my texts. I'm not exactly in her top 10 list of priorities." "That's the problem," Mark said. "She's trying to decide if she wants you at the wedding. And I think part of her is scared that inviting you opens a door she's not ready to walk through. But not inviting you, that's another wound she'll carry." I stared at him. This was the man who'd taken my place in every family photo, who'd been called Dad at every milestone. And here he was, urging me to step back in, not for him, but for her. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mark leaned forward. "Because I care about her, and I think you do too, even if you haven't been able to show it the way you wanted. I'm not your enemy, Nam. But if she's going to move forward in her life without carrying bitterness, she needs the truth. and you're the only one who can give it to her. I rubbed my face, feeling the roughness of my stubble. The truth isn't that simple. There are things I did, mistakes that I made. I don't know if hearing my side makes anything better. That's not for you to decide, Mark said gently. She deserves the choice. Let her decide what to forgive. We sat in silence for a while. The hum of the diner filled the space between us, along with the clatter of plates and the hiss of the coffee machine. My mind was racing. Claire in a wedding dress. Claire looking at the empty chair where her father should be. It hit me then. This wasn't just about making peace for myself. This was about whether she walked into her future still carrying the shadow of my absence. You think she wants to see me? I asked. Mark paused. I think she wants answers. Whether she wants you, that's something she hasn't figured out yet, but she can't figure it out without hearing your voice. I didn't respond right away, because for the first time in years, I realized this wasn't about whether I was ready to see her. It was about whether she was ready to see me, and ready to confront the pieces of her life she'd been told to keep boxed up. Mark finally pushed his untouched coffee toward me. She doesn't know we're meeting. I'm not going to force this. But if you're going to tell her, it has to be soon, before the invitations go out, before the choices are made for her. I nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Mark gave a small smile. That's all I'm asking. But as I drove back to my motel that afternoon, thinking about it didn't feel like an option. This wasn't just another chance to make a call or send a gift. This was the point where the road split. I could keep driving past the exit, tell myself she was fine without me. Or I could take the turn, knowing full well it might lead to another dead end. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't content to keep moving. I wanted to stop, to face whatever came next, even if it meant hearing her say the words I had dreaded for years. I don't want you there. That night, in the stillness of my motel room, I made a decision. Whatever happened, I was going to tell her the truth, even if it was the last thing she ever heard from me. The invitation came in a simple white envelope. Claire's birthday, small gathering. The handwriting was neat, careful, like she wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. I stared at it for a long time before deciding to go. It wasn't the wedding invitation I knew was coming, but maybe it was a bridge, a small step toward being included, even on the edges. The restaurant was a cozy Italian place downtown. When I tarried, I saw her through the front window, laughing with a group of friends around a long table. Mark sat nearby, comfortable as always, smiling at something one of them said. I hesitated at the door. For a moment, I considered turning around, but then she saw me. Her expression didn't change much. No rush of joy, no glare of resentment, just polite surprise. She stood to greet me, and I gave her a careful hug. "Dad," she said softly. The word still felt strange in her mouth, like she hadn't decided if it belonged to me. She led me to a seat near the end of the table. Not next to her, but close enough to feel like I was part of the scene. For the first few minutes, I just listened, letting the sound of her laughter wash over me. Then someone at the other end of the table asked her about the man sitting next to her. "Claire, this is your dad." She smiled easily, glancing toward Mark. "That's my dad, Mark. And this—" She turned slightly toward me, is my biological father. He left when I was in kindergarten." The words were spoken casually, almost effortlessly. There was no malice in her voice, but there was no softness either. Just a simple statement of fact. It hit harder than if she'd shouted. I forced a smile, nodding toward the table. "That's right, I'm numb." The conversation moved on quickly, but my heart didn't. The phrase repeated in my head. He left when I was in kindergarten. It wasn't false, but the way she said it, it reduced years of complicated choices, sleepless nights, and silent regrets to a single, damning line. For the rest of the meal, I stayed quiet, laughing at the right moments, answering polite questions. Mark glanced at me once, a knowing look in his eyes, but he said nothing. When the cake came out, candles glowing, I watched her close her eyes and make a wish. I wondered if it had anything to do with me. I wondered if it ever had. After the plates were cleared and the check was settled, people began hugging goodbye. I waited until the crowd thinned before approaching her. "Thank you for inviting me," I said. She gave a polite smile. I thought it was time. I nodded, but inside, something twisted. Time for what exactly? Time to acknowledge me just enough to keep the guilt away? Or time to make sure everyone understood the boundaries? As I walked to my truck, the words from the table kept circling back. He left when I was in kindergarten. I had expected the distance. I had even expected the awkwardness. But hearing my role in her life summed up like that, in front of strangers, in front of Mark, was something else entirely. And as I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, I realized something. This wasn't just another sting. This was the breaking point. The kind of moment you don't drive away from without deciding what comes next. I drove for almost an hour without really knowing where I was headed. The streets blurred into highways, highways into empty stretches of road. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than they needed to, like holding on could keep the words from replaying in my head. He left when I was in kindergarten. It echoed over and over until it became more than just her voice. It became a verdict, a sentence I'd been living under for nearly 3 decades. And the worst part was, I'd never fought it. I pulled off at a rest stop and killed the engine. The sudden silence hit me like a wall. For years, I'd been running from these moments, the stillness where the truth had room to speak. I leaned back in the seat, staring at the ceiling of the cab. The truth was ugly. I had left. I had failed. And maybe, in her eyes, that's all there ever would be to the story. But as I sat there, another thought started pushing its way through. I couldn't change what happened, but maybe I could change how it ended. I'd been living like a man on parole from his own life, afraid to push too close, afraid to ask for more than the polite scraps of connection I was given. But seeing her there, smiling at strangers while she reduced me to a line of backstory, it did something to me. The guilt I'd carried for years didn't vanish, but it shifted. It hardened. It stopped being something that kept me quiet and started becoming something that told me I couldn't leave things like this. Because what she believed wasn't the whole truth. She had one version, the one Emily had told her, the one that made me the man who chose the road over his family. But there were parts she'd never heard, not excuses, not a rewritten history. just the truth she deserved before she closed the book on me completely. Mark's words at the diner came back to me. Let her decide what to forgive. I thought about that a long time. Forgiveness wasn't something I could demand, but honesty, that was mine to give. I started replaying the moments in my head, the last years of my marriage, the fights, the debts I tried to shield her from. I remembered the night I left, how I'd convinced myself I was protecting her by stepping away. I remembered every birthday card that came back unopened, every gift returned. I'd let that story harden into a single damning sentence. I'd let silence do the talking for me. No more. Somewhere between the rest stop and the motel, a plan started forming. Not the kind of plan you map out on paper, but the kind you feel in your bones. I was done waiting for her to decide when or if she wanted to hear from me. If she was going to keep carrying this story into her wedding, into her future, it wasn't going to be without knowing there was more to it. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There was a good chance she'd slam the door in my face, maybe even cut me out for good. But at least then, she'd be making her choice with the full truth, not the edited version. That night, back at the motel, I sat at the desk and pulled out a notebook. I started writing, not a speech, not a plea, but the story as it happened. The real reasons I left, the things I'd done wrong, the things I'd tried to do right. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't flattering, but it was honest. And as I wrote, something inside me shifted again. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to her distance. I was acting. I was moving toward something, even if it terrified me. The guilt was still there. It probably always would be, but it wasn't the kind that kept me quiet anymore. It was the kind that pushed me forward. When I finally put the pen down, the pages in front of me felt heavier than paper had any right to. They were the weight of my past, and maybe, just maybe, the key to changing the ending. I didn't know exactly how I was going to give them to her. I didn't know if she'd even read them. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to leave her wedding, her marriage, her future with only half the truth. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to purpose. And purpose, I realized, was a lot more powerful than guilt. Back at my motel room, the notebook lay on the desk, but I knew words alone wouldn't be enough. A story could be dismissed as an excuse. Proof. That was harder to ignore. I opened the old duffel bag I'd been carrying for years. At the bottom, beneath worn clothes and a pair of work gloves, was a smaller, battered box. Inside were the pieces of my past I'd never been able to throw away. The first layer was a stack of receipts, wire transfers I'd made in the years after the divorce. They weren't much, not compared to what Mark could provide, but they were what I had. Every few months, whatever I could spare went into an account Emily controlled. I never knew how much of it reached Claire, but I sent it anyway. Underneath the receipts were photographs. Some were of me, grinning awkwardly in front of my truck, or standing outside rest stops with postcards in my hand. Others were of gifts I'd bought: a snow globe from Denver, a teddy bear from Missouri, a charm bracelet from Phoenix. I'd photographed them before mailing them, almost like I knew I'd need proof they'd existed. And then there were the letters. Dozens of them, all addressed to Claire. some in childish handwriting when she was small, others more carefully written as she grew older. I picked one up, dated just before her 10th birthday. The envelope was sealed, but the flap had yellowed with age. That's when I noticed something strange. Some envelopes had never been opened. I flipped through the stack. A dozen, maybe more, still sealed. My chest tightened. These weren't the ones that had come back to me. These had never even left her house. I sat there for a long time, holding one of the envelopes. My handwriting on the front, her name in careful script, and no sign that she'd ever read what was inside. It didn't take much to guess how they'd ended up this way. Emily. It wasn't hard to imagine her deciding those letters weren't worth giving to Claire. Maybe she thought she was protecting her. Maybe she thought she was protecting herself. Either way, the result was the same. My voice never reached my daughter. The realization hit like a slow burn. For years, I'd lived under the weight of her silence, assuming she'd rejected me, that she'd chosen not to answer. But what if she'd never even been given the choice? That changed everything. I gathered the unopened letters, setting them aside from the rest. They felt heavier than the others, as if they carried years of words suspended in time. I spent the next few hours organizing everything. The receipts, the photographs, the gifts that never made it. I laid them out on the bed. The story of my absence told not through excuses, but through the quiet evidence of someone who never really stopped trying. By the time I finished, the bedspread was covered in paper and pictures. It didn't look like much. It certainly didn't look like enough to erase the years I'd missed. But it was real. It was mine. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough to make her see that the story she'd been told wasn't the whole truth. The question now was how to show it to her, and when. The wedding was coming. Mark's words echoed in my head. She deserves the choice. Let her decide what to forgive. I didn't know if this would change her mind. I didn't know if it would change anything at all. But I knew one thing for certain. If I stayed silent now, I'd be letting the same story win again. And I was done letting silence speak for me. I didn't sleep much in the days leading up to the wedding. The box of evidence stayed on the motel dresser, like a silent passenger waiting for the moment it would matter. Every time I looked at it, I wondered if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, or the only right choice I had left. Mark had been right about one thing. I wasn't invited to the wedding, not officially. But I knew the venue, and I knew the date. The idea of showing up uninvited felt wrong. I didn't want to steal her moment, turn her wedding into another chapter in the long book of my failures. So I found another way. It started with a phone call to someone I hadn't spoken to in years, an old friend who now worked as a videographer. I explained what I wanted, not a confrontation, not a speech, but a message. Something Claire could see and hear without me standing there, casting a shadow on her day. He came to my motel room with a small camera. I cleared the table, set the letters, photos, and receipts out in front of me. Then I sat down, feeling more nervous than I had in years. When the red light came on, I didn't read from a script. I just spoke. Claire, if you're watching this, it means your wedding day is here. I won't pretend I have the right to stand next to you or that I've earned a place in your life. I haven't. But there are things I need you to know before you walk into your future. I showed her the letters, the ones that had come back to me unopened, and the ones that had never been opened at all. I didn't speculate about why. I didn't point fingers. I just let her see them. These are words you were meant to have. I don't know if reading them now will change anything, but they're yours. I held up the receipts, the photographs of the gifts, the old pictures of me standing by the truck, holding postcards I'd never know if she'd received. I wasn't there the way I should have been. That's on me. But I didn't stop caring. And I want you to know that, even if it doesn't change what you feel about me, it's the truth. I paused, my voice catching. I left because I thought I was protecting you from my mistakes. I see now that I was wrong. Leaving hurt you more than anything I could have shielded you from. I can't undo that, but I can make sure you know the whole story before you take this step in your life. The words came slowly, honestly. No defenses, no demands. Just a truth that had been buried for too long. When I finished, I handed the camera back to my friend. Make sure it gets to her, I said. On the day of the wedding, I stayed far away from the venue. I didn't want to see the looks, the whispers, the moments I didn't belong in. I sat in the motel room with the TV on, muted, the silence loud in my ears. Later, I'd hear how it unfolded. The video played during the reception, not as part of the planned program, but slipped in quietly between speeches. There was no drama, no angry outburst. Just my voice on the screen, my face older, worn but steady. Some people in the room were confused. Some looked uncomfortable. But I was told Claire didn't take her eyes off the screen. I didn't know what she felt in that moment. Anger, sadness, relief, maybe all of it. But for the first time in decades, she'd heard my voice tell my story, not the version shaped by absence or someone else's words. And that, for me, was the first strike. Not against her, not against Mark, against the silence that had defined us for too long. The call came 2 days after the wedding. I almost didn't answer when I saw her name on the screen. Her voice was sharp, controlled, but underneath it, I could hear the hurt. "How dare you send that video on my wedding day?" she said. I took a breath. "Claire, no, you don't get to call me that right now." Her tone cut through me like a blade. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? Everyone was there, my friends, my husband's family. And you made it about you. I let the silence stretch, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. "You've been absent my whole life," she continued, her voice cracking for the first time. "And then, on the most important day of my life, you decide to show up like some dramatic movie moment? Do you know how selfish that is?" "I wasn't trying to ruin your day," I said quietly. "I was trying to give you the truth before you took the next step. That's all." "That's all?" she echoed bitterly. "You think that changes anything? You think 25 years of absence can be erased by a video?" Before I could respond, another voice came on the line. Steady, familiar. "Claire," Mark said, "you need to let me talk to him for a minute." There was a shuffle. Then his voice came through clearly. "Nam, she's upset. You knew she would be. But I need you to know something." I waited, tense, wondering if this was the moment he told me I'd finally crossed the line. You told the truth, Mark said simply. And she needs to hear that, even if she's angry right now. I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. You're agreeing with me? I'm not saying the timing was perfect, he admitted. But everything you said in that video, it was true. I've known for years. I told her mother more than once that keeping those letters from her was wrong. But Emily had her reasons, and I wasn't in a position to undo them without creating more damage. I leaned back against the wall of the motel room, the weight of his words settling over me. She's angry because the truth doesn't fit the version of you she's carried for years, Mark continued. That doesn't mean it shouldn't have been told. It just means it's going to take time for her to reconcile it. There was a pause. Then a softer voice came on the line again. Claire's. I don't know what to believe right now, she said. The anger was still there, but it was layered with something else, confusion. Everything I thought I knew about you. It's just different now. I need time. You can have all the time you need, I said. I just didn't want you to start your marriage carrying a story that wasn't the whole truth. There was silence. Then she said, almost reluctantly, Mark says you didn't lie. I didn't, I said. More silence. Then she sighed. I can't promise anything, but I'll call you when I'm ready. The line went dead. I sat there for a long time, the quiet pressing in around me. For the first time in decades, the wall between us had shifted. Not broken, but shifted. Enough for the first crack of light to show through. And I knew, no matter how long it took, that was worth everything. It was a week after the wedding when my phone rang again. This time, it was Mark. Can you meet us? He asked. His tone was steady, but there was something deliberate in it. Us? I repeated. Claire and I. Neutral place. She has questions. Neutral place turned out to be a quiet coffee shop on the edge of the city. When I walked in, Claire was already there, sitting with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Mark sat next to her, a calm presence as always. I approached slowly. Thank you for coming, I said. This isn't about thanking you. She replied flatly. This is about answers. I've been thinking about what you said in that video, and I can't make sense of it. Some of it matches what Mom told me. Some of it doesn't, and I don't know what to believe. Before I could respond, Mark spoke. That's why I asked you both to meet. There's something I should have said a long time ago. Claire turned to him, frowning. Mark? He took a deep breath, then looked at her directly. Over the years, I've received letters from Nam for you. Her brow furrowed. Letters? What letters? Mark reached into his bag and placed a small bundle on the table. Claire stared at it like it was a foreign object. These are the ones I was able to keep, Mark said. There were more, but Emily, she didn't give them to you. She didn't want you confused. She thought it would be better if you didn't hear from him. Claire's eyes snapped to me. You're saying you actually wrote to me all those years? I nodded slowly. Every birthday, every holiday, just to check in. I didn't know you weren't getting them. She stared at the stack of envelopes. Her hands hovered over them, hesitant, like touching them might change something she wasn't ready for. I didn't say anything before, Mark continued, because I didn't want to undermine your mother. But after the wedding, after that video, I realized the truth was going to come out anyway, and it should come from me. Claire's voice was quiet, almost trembling. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Mark hesitated, because I didn't want you to feel like you had to choose between us. I thought I was protecting you. Maybe I was wrong. The coffee shop seemed to fall silent around us. Claire finally picked up one of the letters, still sealed. My handwriting faded with time. Her voice cracked as she spoke. All these years, I thought you just stopped caring. I leaned forward, my voice low. I never stopped caring, Claire. I made mistakes. I made bad choices. But I never stopped trying. You just never got the chance to see it. Her eyes glistened. But she didn't cry. Not yet. She sat back, staring at the letters as if they were puzzle pieces she didn't know how to fit into the picture she'd carried for so long. Mark placed a steady hand on her shoulder. You don't have to figure it all out today, but now you know, and knowing is better than wondering. She looked at me, her voice soft but steady. I need time, a lot of it, but I believe you. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first time in decades that she'd said anything that felt like a door opening instead of closing. The week after the coffee shop meeting was quiet. No angry phone calls, no sudden invitations, just silence. But it didn't feel like the silence I'd known for years, the kind filled with finality. This one felt unsettled, like something in motion that hadn't reached its end yet. Claire didn't forgive me that day. She didn't hug me or say she wanted me back in her life. But she didn't shut the door either. She said she needed time, and for the first time in decades, I believed her words weren't just a polite way of saying goodbye. Mark kept in touch. Short texts every few days. She's reading the letters, or she asked about the truck you used to drive. Small updates, but each one felt like a mile marker on a road I thought was gone. One afternoon, Mark called. She's still guarded, he said, but she's not angry the way she was. That's progress. I don't expect her to change overnight, I replied. I just don't want to make things worse. You're not, he assured me. Right now, my job is to keep the door open. Your job is to be patient. It was strange, thinking of him as my ally, after so many years imagining him as my replacement. But the truth was, without Mark, this conversation between Claire and me wouldn't even exist. He was the bridge she trusted, the one person who could speak my name without her shutting down. Weeks passed. There were no dramatic reunions, no teary phone calls, but there was movement. A text from Claire, short but unexpected. I read one of your letters, the one from my 10th birthday. I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Thank you for reading it." Her reply came minutes later. It was strange. I don't remember you being there, but I guess you were in a way. That was all. But it was more than I'd had in years. Mark called again a few days later. She's not ready to see you face to face yet, he said, but she's talking about you without bitterness. That's a start. And I realized he was right. This wasn't about a sudden reconciliation. It was about showing up consistently, quietly, until the idea of me in her life wasn't a disruption, but a presence she could trust. For now, that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I began to understand something I hadn't before. Redemption wasn't about stepping back into the role I'd once held. It wasn't about reclaiming a title or pretending the years hadn't happened. It was about making sure she had the truth and the peace that my absence had denied her. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that getting my daughter back was never going to mean Sunday dinners and holiday photos. It might never mean hearing her call me dad without hesitation, and that was okay. What mattered was that she walked into the rest of her life without a distorted story weighing her down. She didn't have to forgive me to live without that burden. Mark called me again in early December. "She's been quieter lately," he said, "but not in a bad way. I think she's processing. And I think she's starting to see you as part of her truth, not just her past." I didn't push for details. Patience had become the only thing I could offer her without risk of undoing the fragile progress we'd made. Then, a week before Christmas, there was an envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Just my name and handwriting I recognized instantly. Inside was a simple Christmas card. On the front was a snowy cabin scene. Inside, a few words written in blue ink. "Merry Christmas. From your daughter." Still learning how to say it. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, reading that line over and over. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an apology. But it was something better. It was a beginning. And for the first time in decades, I felt like maybe the road between us wasn't closed. It was just under construction.